Progressive Sexualities in the Caribbean Imagination. There's a chapter that I'm reading part of from today, which is on trans folks. There's a chapter on lesbians, there's a chapter on same-sex among women, same-sex among men. There's a chapter on straight women and sexual agency. There's a chapter on straight men and interracial relationships. So I'm doing a lot of things in that book. But I'm going to give you a little piece today. I'm going to talk about trans people in the media in the Caribbean, and those who exhibit gender nonconformity, whether deliberately or unconsciously, and whether through behavior, dress, speech, or some combination of all of these, are often considered ineligible to be full, legitimate members of Caribbean societies. As elsewhere, their sexuality is automatically suspect. That's why we often talk about trans people with other sexual minorities. And since they are far from the ideal citizens, too often the state sees the need not to treat them, or sees no need to treat them as full citizens or to protect them from others' mistreatment. In the first chapter of my book, I argue that there is a continuum of gender variant experience, what I call trans experience, in the Caribbean, the range of which includes people who live as a gender other than that assigned to them at birth, and those who perform transvestite carnival characters. I argue that in the Caribbean, the portrayal of trans people is kind of a backhanded one, right? So in some ways, we're kind of progressive because those portrayals exist, but on the other hand, we're acknowledging their existence while refusing them the possibility of full lives or citizenship. And I spend about 5 pages in the chapter discussing the terms that are used to refer to trans people. I'm not going to go through all of that, but I acknowledge that it is a problematic term, right? And to use terms that Caribbean people have neither created nor always identified with, without attention to their histories, etymologies, and their relationship to power, to me kind of commits a kind of violence. So using North American or European terms that do not resonate within the region could also be seen as supporting a common belief that unconventional genders and non-heteronormative sexualities are something that has been imported, right? They're foreign menaces that amount to a kind of post-colonial imperialism. There are, of course, some indigenous terms that specifically describe unconventional genders, such as travesti, matimen, macha, man royal, cambiada, dress-up girls, etc. I'm going to use the term trans as a kind of umbrella term for unconventional genders, regardless whether the individuals in question have had any kind of hormonal or surgical body modification. So for me, trans refers to a range of identities and the varieties of strategies that people use to choose, inhabit, or express a gender other than that which society assigns to their bodies. So I'm going to discuss and describe trans treatment in Caribbean law and media in 3 different instances. So now I'll have the first slide, please. Some of you may be familiar with Joelle D'Souza. In 1997, the mainstream press in Trinidad and Tobago and several international outlets reported her successful court case. A Trinidadian trans woman who had gender reassignment surgery at the age of 19, and she's a self-identified transgender woman. D'Souza won a settlement against the state of Trinidad and Tobago for unlawful arrest and police harassment, and she received sympathetic local press coverage, which surprised some people. Earlier that year, 1997, a photographer who, quote, this is her speaking, knew all about her past and was taking pictures of her without her permission, had invaded her personal space. She pushed him away and was subsequently arrested and charged with assault. While at the police station, officers, quote, taunted her for hours about her sexuality, end quote, and she was eventually strip searched. After this incident, D'Souza brought suit against the state, and during the case, she was represented by one of Trinidad's most prominent lawyers, Lynette Maharaj, who was wife of the then sitting Attorney General. The case was eventually settled out of court, and she received a cash settlement of an undisclosed sum that she donated to charity. Next slide, please. In August of 2011, Ignacio Estrada and Wendy Iriepa self-identified respectively as a gay man and a transsexual woman. As many of you know, Cuba now actually provides for free gender reassignment surgery. So the two of them got married and left a courthouse after being joined in what was described as the first wedding of its kind in the country and perhaps in the Caribbean region. Estrada explained that the couple purposefully married on Fidel Castro's birthday, quote, to remind him of the atrocities he committed against the Cuban gay community. Of course, the camps from many years ago. The beautiful, conventionally beautiful light-skinned Cubans in their wedding finery were extremely camera-ready, as you can see, and enthusiastically publicized their marriage. The story was picked up by The Guardian UK, The Huffington Post, Reuters, Al Jazeera, and many other outlets, and videos and photographs of them continue to be very easily found on the internet. More than a decade after de Souza's arrest and eventual triumph, and over a year before Estrada and Iriepa's wedding, in what has been described as a series of crackdowns on the 6th and 7th of February in 2010, 8 Guyanese, next slide please, who have been described variously as transgenders, men, and cross-dressers, but who do not self-identify in any of the materials that I've discovered, were arrested and charged with cross-dressing under Statute 153 of Guyana's Summary Jurisdiction Offenses Act. This statute makes it illegal for anyone who, quote, being a man in any public way or public place for any improper purpose appears in female attire, or being a woman in any public way or public place for any improper purpose appears in male attire, end quote. They were detained over the weekend, all were strip searched, some were denied medical treatment, and those who asked why they were being held were given no answer. On Monday, the 9th of February, again in 2010, so this is after they've been held for the weekend, they appeared with without legal counsel before Chief Magistrate Melissa Robinson, who, among other comments, quote, told the applicants that they must go to church and should give their lives to Jesus Christ, and, quote, that they were confused about their sexuality and that they are men, not women. All of them were fined at least $7,500. Just a few weeks later, with legal representation, the support of local activists, and growing international attention, 4 of those arrested and the Guyana-based Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, SASOD, filed a motion with the Guyanese High Court arguing that the law against cross-dressing is unconstitutional because it is discriminatory, and that both the police and the magistrate mistreated the accused. And the University of the West Indies Rights Advocacy Project is supporting the litigation. At this time, the arguments have been completed, but no judgment has yet been issued. We're expecting it, I think, in the fall, possibly. One major distinction between these cases is that the Trinidadian case did not involve any law explicitly referencing gender or sexuality, right? She was arrested for assaulting a police officer, and she sued for improper arrest. So none of those laws are explicitly referencing gender or sexuality. While the Cuban marriage involved a law that implicitly involves sexuality and explicitly relates to gender, right? So marriage in Cuba is legally between a man and a woman. But interestingly enough, because gender reassignment surgery is legal and transsexuality is recognized in Cuba, the couple was not actually violating the law. So they're saying they have this really kind of transgressive relationship, but legally, it's actually a normal relationship. In contrast, the group that I'm calling the Guyanese 4 were arrested and fined under and are now suing to repeal a statute that specifically bans public gender transgression. The language of the law is very revealing. First, it insists that the individual in question must be a man or a woman. But the law does not provide a definition of these terms. So the task of defining falls to the police responsible for enforcing the law and the judges responsible for interpreting the law. Clearly, the magistrate who originally heard the case was very confident in her own definitions of man and woman, and in her decision that the defendants were confused, in her words, about their own gender. So this case is a real-world example of established binary gender categories and how they affect people. The second important phrase in this statute is that transvestism should not occur, quote, in any public way or public place or for any improper purpose. Accordingly, when they were in the privacy of any of their own homes getting dressed, they were not violating the law. And if their destination was a friend's house or a house party, when they arrive at their destination, they're also not violating the law. But if their destination was a restaurant or a club that was privately owned but open to the public, it's unclear whether or not their presence there would be illegal. And in walking en route to their respective destination, the arrested Guyanese were certainly contravening the state's stated goal of preserving public propriety. However, if transvestism poses such a threat to the public, one wonders what the proper purpose would be, right? Because it says for any improper purpose. So you can wonder if that is stage comedy, drag performances, performances during carnival such as Dame Lorraine, Mother Sally, etc. But of course the law doesn't define that. Statute 153 also makes reference to male attire and female attire. And as with other terms in the law, these are quite subjective. When is a pantsuit male and when is it female? What shape must a pair of earrings be to be female? And again, they're implicitly leaving these judgments up to the police and the magistrates. Based even on this brief reading, it seems that the contention that Statute 153 is vague has a lot of merit. Nevertheless, it is certain that the Guyanese Four's lawsuit will be a long battle, fought as much in the Guyanese public sphere as in the courts. And another scholar writes that, quote, the institution of the nation state solidifies and fixes identities, marginalizing and excluding the transvestite who, because of her gender identification, cannot be fully accepted as a national subject because she transgresses the limits of what the nation state deems acceptable and productive, end quote. I think that this is true in Guyana, where the letter of the law explicitly vilifies improper gender expression and requires a fine of the offenders. It seems, however, to me that color, race, and class can be mitigating factors in the state's treatment of trans people around the region. So as everyone probably knows, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana have similar racial populations and similar colonial history, right? But they also differ in many ways, including in relationship to laws regarding transvestism. While a local regulation specific to the 1895 Carnival in Trinidad banned transvestism, and in particular the pisoni masquerade, which if you're curious I can tell you about later, there do not appear to be any current laws against transvestism in Trinidad and Tobago. On the other hand, Guyana's law is still clearly on the books and is selectively enforced. Keeping in mind these differences when comparing the cases of Joelle D'Souza and the Guyanese Four, race and class stand out as prominent factors in their treatment. So newspaper accounts comment on the Lebanese Trinidadian D'Souza's beauty so often that another scholar, Omisheke Tinsley, describes the journalist as mythifying her. Her fair-skinned femininity contributes to her ability to pass as female, which combined with male reporters' documentation of their own response to her desirability. I mean, they're saying they're attracted to her, they would date with her, they're interested in her, and all these kinds of things. All of this works to represent her as a real woman who deserves the justice that she fought for, right? While it is true that these portrayals are simultaneously exoticizing and patronizing, and supportive and appreciative all at the same time, the unspoken implication is that those who are less fair-skinned and less conventionally beautiful are also deserving of less justice. Indeed, the Guyanese Four, who are still waiting and working for justice, are all of African or mixed African and Indian descent. And though notions of light and dark skin vary, none of the Guyanese who've been arrested, who were arrested in this case, can be considered as fair as D'Souza or as the Cuban couple, right? And these pictures at the top are actually mugshots that were taken from Starbrook News, right? So these are pictures of themselves that they did not have control over and which were publicized without their consent. The picture on the bottom is taken from Kaiso's blog, the G-Spot. And so this is actually one of the litigants in a self-presentation, right? So in a way that she wanted to appear in public. I didn't put their names because their names, again, were not printed with their consent, and some of them go by names other than their official, what would be kind of on their official documentation. The Guyanese Four have given almost no interviews, and half of those arrested chose not to continue with the case at all, right? So remember, more people were arrested than actually went forward with the case. And while this may well be part of a legal strategy, it is in stark contrast to the many interviews and photo ops provided by D'Souza, Estrada, and Iriepa, and also may be linked to the power of class. D'Souza is part of a wealthy local family, and she owns her own business, which again was often reported in the media that she was a business owner. And these are resources that enabled her to have the economic and social capital to have gender reassignment surgery in the first place, and to legally fight for justice with powerhouse representation. On the other hand, again, those arrested in Guyana are all working class. and the media reporting portrays bias. Coverage of D'Souza far more often mentions that she is a business owner than the fact that she is also a hairdresser. So think about the fact that if they never mentioned she was a business owner and just called her a hairdresser, how people might have perceived her differently. The implication is that she is a proprietor who makes a significant economic contribution to society. No mention is made of the professions of the Guyanese Four. No details that might imply that they deserve better treatment than they receive are included. If they were fairer or closer to stereotypical European beauty or wealthy business owners, would they have still been abused by police and the judge in the first place? And if so, after protesting, would they have become the local media darlings that D'Souza did? Would international media have been as interested in their wedding if Iriepa and Estrada were Afro-Cuban, or if their wedding did not have the fairy tale trappings of a fancy white dress and tuxedo and a convertible that was slowly driving through the street? And if D'Souza had been darker or her manners or genealogy less kind of refined, would her case have ended so quickly and in her favor? And of course, we don't know the answers to these questions, but we do know that color, race, and class often result in differing treatment no matter where one is in the world, right, including the Caribbean. So in Caribbean law and media, it seems that whether trans people are embraced or legitimized as citizens or targeted for persecution does depend on class and color. Next slide, please. In the Caribbean, we prefer our trans people fair-skinned, runway gorgeous, and of a certain class. And indeed, while Caribbean trans people do live in the region, sometimes quite well and with communal and familial acceptance, the ability of Caribbean law and Caribbean literature to imagine trans people as full citizens is directly related to the class and color of the individuals in question. The popular Caribbean imagination is broad enough, I think, to encompass the concept of transgenders, of unconventional genders. As the list of terms describing these individuals at the start of my talk indicates. But these concepts mostly do not actually disturb binary gender or heteropatriarchal ideals, which are further reinforced by those who are actually in charge of making and enforcing legislative and economic policy. So what I've ended with is I like to kind of keep current with the media, right? So this morning, I went on Google Images and typed in Caribbean trans. And the bottom pictures are the pictures that I showed you before. The other pictures are what comes up. So you've got in the corner, Taina from the Jamaica PSAs, right, who has publicly identified as transgender. This image again is from CAISO. This is 3 trans activists, including Peaches again. This image is from Colombia. It's talking about the murder of trans sex workers. And this is Adele, I forget Adele's last name, but who's the first, touted as the first elected trans person in Cuba. So the question of within inequality, are there further inequities, and what the image looks like and who controls the image can shape the story of trans people in the region.